I hope this video finds you happy, healthy, and safe. If you're new here, my name is Rhonda with Rhonda's Craft Frenzy, and if you're not new, now you know. I appreciate you spending your time here with me. I thank you very much for that. Today I'm going to show you how I put together these 3 farmhouse DIYs that are super pretty and super simple to make. So let's get right to it. I'll beat you to the craft table. For this first DIY, I used 4 of those foam blocks that came from the Dollar Tree in the toy section. I painted them with acrylic paint in the color of elephant gray, but I wasn't really happy with that. So for the second coat, I used Waverly's chalk paint in the color moss. I liked it much better. And once it was dry, I went over it with the dry brush technique with the oatmeal colored chalk paint just to age it a little bit. While that was drying, I cut out these inspirational quotes from the back of a calendar I purchased from the Dollar Tree. I rounded the edges with my scissors, and then I glued them with a glue stick to attach them to the block. And I put a coat of Mod Podge over the top of that, and I let them dry. The last thing I did was I hot glued some letters HOME on another side. My thought was if you saw them from the top, you'd look down at that cute quote, and then you'd see the HOME part of it when you look straight on. They look really pretty on my tier tray and I love them. I hope you like them too. The second DIY I have for you today was a little bit more involved, but super pretty with its end result. I started out with a 3D wreath form that I got at the Dollar Tree, and I ended up using the smaller sized one. I first formed it into the ball with the little taggy things that came with it, and then I added some hot glue and wrapped jute string around the top and the bottom just for a more secure hold. Once that was done, I had this wide ribbon burlap that came from Walmart, and I wrapped this around the wreath and glued it into place as best I could. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're not going to see this in the end. I just needed something on there in order to glue my flowers onto it, and this was the best option I came up with. Once the ribbon was covering all the sections of the ball, I gave it a trim. I cut anything sticking out from around the sides and returned it to the shape that it came in as best I could. Then I started to add the greenery. I used 5 bunches of boxwood picks that I got at Walmart. I love these, and they're only 97 cents for each pick. Can't go wrong there. I picked them apart and I glued them all to the ball with the stems all going in the same directions. Now I know this part doesn't look very pretty, but please stick with me because in the end it is. Once those were all glued where I wanted them, I used these pretty picks that came from the Dollar Tree called Blooming Branches. There were some smaller flowers and some larger ones, and I ended up using both sides. I just glued them all the way around where you could still see the burlap. Once the flowers were all glued into the place, I felt like it needed a little something more, so I added some leaves that came from rose picks. I used just the roses in another DIY and the leaves were left over. I like to use anything I have on hand to save my time and some money, so please use whatever you have on hand, or maybe you could just leave this part out if you didn't have the leaves. I glued those leaves only around the larger flowers, and I think it was what it needed. I was satisfied with it. So next I needed to put my topiary in something, and I had this metal planter and a base to a terracotta pot, but I didn't really care for the color. I wanted it to look galvanized, so I started out with spray painting it silver. Once the spray paint was dry, I used a gray paint and I dabbed it all over the planter. I did the same thing with the black paint. I mixed it in with the gray to make the gray a little bit darker. And lastly, I did this same technique with the white paint. I did this on both pieces until I was happy with the way it looked. The last thing I did to these pieces was to use burnt umber acrylic paint to add a more aged look. So I did this around the top, I did it around the bottom and the seams, basically anywhere that it would have had rust on it if it was an old piece. I painted a dowel rod that came from Walmart, the second biggest size they had. I can't remember the thickness, but I painted it in Waverly chalk paint in the color moss. And I didn't want to cover the whole stick. I still wanted it to have that aged look, so I left some of that wood showing. I then glued the floral block inside the planter and stuffed craft paper around the outside of it to hold the foam in its place but also to use it as a filler. So this one was a little bit time consuming, but well worth it for me. I've been looking for something similar to this topiary, and I couldn't find anything for less than $50, and that was for a much smaller sized one. I did this for under $15, so it's a hit for me. I love it, and I hope you do as well. My final DIY today was super simple but makes such a beautiful statement. I started out with a slice of birchwood, some beads, and another quote from the calendar I used in my first DIY. I had these pretty gray, aged looking beads. I believe they came from Walmart, I'm not certain of that. They were attached to a jute string with a knot in between each one, so I cut them apart. And I also did this with my jute string. I pulled it apart to make a smaller piece of jute string so that my beads would fit on it. I placed some tape on one end to help it from fraying, and then I strung the beads, alternating the wood beads with the gray ones. Then I made a tassel. I used the same jute string, wrapping it around a card a few times. Then I tied it up on one end, and I separated the other end where the fringe was just to make it a little bit fuller looking. Then I used my Dremel to put a hole through the top of the disc just to be able to attach the string of beads to it. I glued my quote onto the birch slice with the glue stick, and then I put a coat of Mod Podge over it. So I attached my tassel to one end of the strand, and once the Mod Podge was dry, I attached that wood slice to the other end and tied it off. I think it makes such a nice statement, and you can use it pretty much anywhere in your home. I'm loving it, and I hope you do too. As always, I appreciate you spending your time with me today. I hope you found some inspiration in these videos. That is my intent. I really hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. It helps my channel grow. And if you saw something you like, please hit that thumbs up button. Don't be shy with your comments either. I hope I see you next time, and until then, keep those glue guns at the ready.